make a comment. If you, yeah, then maybe say a little bit about yourself, and then in the context that is in relation maybe to your question. That would be really nice. And let me just introduce you. So and I don't even know whether I pronounce it, Capili, Capilano University. It's interesting because it sounds so Italian, but it's in Canada, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So how do you pronounce it?
Capilano.
Capilano. Okay. So you are a faculty instructor in early
Yeah.
childhood education at Capilano University and atelierista. And that is, of course, a technical term from Reggio Emilia, which you can say a little bit about in a minute. And your research engages with research creation, artography, A/R/tography, and feminist materialism as you explore young children's studio practices, the lively material improvisations, and collective experimentations. So maybe we can start with that. What is an atelierista? You're in early childhood and you're working at a university, and yeah, do you think that is for more people other than people in early childhood, or also, maybe you can start us off, and then we're gonna have a look after that at the questions that people have developed in the reading groups.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Karen. Um, so yes, I'm an instructor as well as an atelierista. Both of them are faculty positions at Capilano University. And I need to sort of stretch back maybe, I actually don't know how many years. I've been at Capilano University now 18 years as an atelierista and instructor. I'm sure, before that, 25 years probably, the university and the Children's Center, which was, is a daycare on campus, made some really significant decisions to do things differently. And beginning with inspiration from Reggio Emilia, trips to Reggio Emilia, began to really shape this very unique partnership where it's not, and so the Children's Center is considered a lab school, but not your typical lab school of students going in to observe and take away. As a lab school is a partnership between the Children's Center and the early childhood department. Also seeing that, and from what I see, the Children's Center as a site of innovation, a site of invention, a site of provocation. It is not just the receiving place of early childhood education department's ideas. And so part of that was very early on making a decision to, first of all, hire a pedagogista. Again, these two roles, pedagogista and atelierista, are from, they originate the ideas of them in Reggio Emilia, this partnership of the pedagogy and the arts, not as one cohesive thing, but these strands that interweave, that interrupt, that intersect each other. And so I came to Capilano University when there was a pedagogista there. They had hired Cristina Delgado Ventimiglia. If you haven't read her work, you should. Who was pedagogista, had studied in the Italian tradition, and so she was there for a year before I came as atelierista. And so her work really set the roots, set the ground of pedagogies, of thinking about, and this to me is very significant, thinking about how she was thinking about pedagogy as the creation of a collective life, as a pedagogy as life making. And the question that she has always provoked and still is alive in the Children's Center is, what kind of a life could we create together? And so as a atelierista, I came in as an artist in intersection with this, really think that, and I think at first the invitation was, how do we not do Reggio Emilia, but how are we inspired by Reggio? How do we take up some of the ideas? And my first entry into the Children's Center was we couldn't do any of this work without nurturing a collective life, a way of thinking together and being together. And so I'm probably wandering a bit. That's a long story. But
No,
as
nice.
as a atelierista, then I bring in the arts. The arts is, and again, strong inspiration from Reggio, but and I've been to Reggio a number of times, been through study tours, atelierista
Mm,
study tours, but it's not about implementing a work. It's about being provoked by it, not even inspired, but provoked, pushed by it. But because it was a different context, it's a Canadian context, and
mm,
I'm at a small university where there was incredible sense of freedom to experiment, to try things out. When we were a very small department, that was our ethos, it always felt to me. So I entered as an atelierista, being able to invent who is the atelierista as I went. So it wasn't just looking to Reggio, how do they do things? It's how do I bring the arts? How do we think through the arts? How does the arts become a way of thinking, of making, of creating, that ideas are shaped in the making? And that's my roots. What I brought was being really rooted in a methodology of artography, which I was incredibly fortunate to be at University of British Columbia at that time, where we were just inventing with, arts-based research that was emerging at the time. A group of us, artists, educators, researchers coming together to invent this methodology. I worked with Rita Irwin and Stephanie Springay closely, as
mm,
well as others. Um, and the ART of artography is the art research teaching or the art research pedagogy, as strands that are distinct but interwoven. And so, and the heart of that to me in those early years that I've always carried is thinking about the arts as a form of research, artistic practice as research. It's not the very early childhood convention or the creative child convention of a child is just full of ideas, they just blurt them out, pour it out. Is as you draw, as you create, as you make something, as you engage in artistic practice, thought is being formed. Um, so briefly, I don't even know if that's brief, but briefly, that is the roots of my work as an atelierista. I work closely in the Children's Center with small groups of children. Um, After years of working in this children's center, it became, the work was bubbling and I needed a space. And so it began, I just claimed a resource room, a storage room to begin with as a studio. And it stayed that way. Now it's taken a whole identity as a children's studio. Um, and as a place to come apart, to work in depth with smaller groups of children, with particular educators, as well as working in the Children's Center. As an instructor, I also work with adult early childhood education students and intersect this work with some really beautiful intersections. I work closely right now with the teacher Johanna. I may mention her as we go. Um, where if I'm teaching a course, so this term I'm teaching a art in early childhood course focusing on drawing. Johanna comes into the class with a group of children with their drawing problems. How do you draw the side view of a giraffe, for instance? And or other questions of how do you draw a crowd of people. And so children come into the class and we don't switch things just because children are there. We become partners in this investigation. So as an atelierista, this work intersects my work with adult students as well as children, as well as early childhood educators, even though the roots of it, the heart of it is really in this way of curriculum making, of researching together with children. And really deep, and I really like how Stephanie Springay writes about artography and research creation as a practice of intimacy, that it's really in the intimate moments, in the nuances of making, the nuances of creating, that you begin to see what is taking shape. That's a roundabout way of saying what I do. But it's a unique position, and I have great respect for Capilano University for trying these innovations. And so we have a pedagogist and an atelierista. Now we have 2 atelieristas on faculty who are faculty positions working in children's centers.
Wow. So maybe, I don't know, but do people need to know a little bit more about Reggio Emilia as a concept? What is it? What does it refer to when you say, I've been to Reggio Emilia? I'm just thinking whether people would like to, or is everyone familiar with it? Put up your hand, maybe, if you would like that, or put it in chat. As I've been there as well once, and I would love to go again. No, everyone is familiar with it. Maybe also for people who might not, and listening to this recording, which might just saying a little bit about Reggio Emilia. It's a place in northern Italy, and why would we go to Reggio Emilia? Ah, yeah. So Charlotte is familiar with it, but she would like to hear more.
Well, I'm no expert on Reggio. I don't pretend to be, but it's as you said, Karen, it's a city in northern Italy that has made a profound commitment to childhood, to really and if you walk through the city, there is this sense that children really matter. There's a slower pace with children. There's children's work throughout the city. The schools have an incredible presence, and they have had a profound global impact. And again, it's this way of, it's rooted in, and I get this all wrong because I am not a child developmentalist, rooted in social construction, but how I interpret that as the co-composition of ideas, where children, as you're working, you're thinking through, you're constructing, you're creating ideas together with others. And again, using the arts as languages. So drawing and painting and sculpting and clay and dance and music, they become languages of inquiry, ways of forming ideas and thinking through ideas together with others. That's my roots in it, is really in the arts. But again, their pedagogies are rich and vibrant, and really, again, this is where I go back to Christina Delgado, this idea of creating a collective life. What does it mean to think together?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really nice. And I think, what really helped me to understand it better is the Contesting Early Childhood series,
Mhm.
where, got Peter Moss and Gunilla Dahlberg, who are so committed to Reggio Emilia, and there are other books in the series. And then there is, of course, Vecchi's book in there,
Yes.
on the atelierista side of things, but I can highly recommend a lot of the books. And then there is also the reference book of Peter Moss. I think that's from 2016. But yeah, it's very inspirational. And but what I love, what you're saying is about it's not even inspired. It's definitely not imitation, but it
No.
is a provocation.
Yeah.
And it has been a provocation for your work. So let's have a look at, what it has provoked, And of course, we've had the opportunity through your 3 articles. And I think one of the questions, I'm just looking at time, what we can do is just split it up into sort of a quarter of an hour for each of them. George has put them in the chat, and for people maybe coming in a bit later, let's refresh the chat, but I'll go through them. So the questions then for you, Sylvia, are first of all mention all 3, and then I suggest we just start with the first one. Is, do you distinguish between pedagogy and research when you do research? The second one is, how do you know as a teacher, atelierista, what to go for and take further? And I think a lot of that was, this is so amazing, but how do you do it, you know, in my situation? And so that might also be an opening for others to say, oh, I would love to incorporate some of this in my research, my teaching, but how? Then the third question is, can you say more about your data analysis and how to attune to data? I love that part actually in the one article where you write a lot about attuning to data and which theorists you find inspiring and why. And now you were talking about Stephanie Springay. I can imagine, you know, just having worked with her so closely. So love your background. Okay, there's someone else is coming in. So welcome for people just new, people just drifting in. I know that some of you have already said as well that they were still teaching or working and now coming in. So let's start with the first one. The first question, do you distinguish between pedagogy and research when you do research? Or maybe
Yeah.
it's a nonsensical question.
Well, I don't actually think about distinction. I think about relationship, that they're always in relation, and it is the pedagogy that is underpinning everything. And again, it's this commitment to what does it mean to create a collective life? What kind of a life? And it's not knowing ahead of time what that is. It's always in the space of creating a collective life. But it's, you know, in a sense, it's not just to me pedagogy and research, it's also the arts, pedagogy and research, always in this relationship. But again, not as parallel streams, you know, but these intersecting, you know, lines of, you know, yarn you might knit with, all three at the same time, you know, so they entangle together, they create something together, but they still have their distinct aspects to them, which is why I have, you know, I've worked very closely with Cristina Delgado Ventimiglia for 13 years. Her as pedagogista, me as atelierista. That still is a very strong relation of the pedagogy interwoven. And the research, again, my research has its roots always tangled up. I guess, you know, I'm a knitter. We're using a knitting metaphor here. Tangle these strands of artography, of art practice as research. And so they're interwoven always. But again, always thinking about research as a living inquiry. It's not something I go in and do and take away. It's not an observational act. It's a living act of living the intimate, the nuances in the touch, not just observing and documenting, but research that is in the movement together with others and beginning to, and as an research as an artistic practice as well, so that I'm always in the research trying to create something, bring together strands, bring together things to actually create something. So it's a particular way, I think, of thinking about research, a particular way of thinking about the arts and of pedagogy that intertwine, but it's not, you know, at some time I'm thinking pedagogy and other times thinking research. It's always these three entangled together, which is why I've been really drawn to research creation, this idea of the research and creation in a hyphenated, always in movement space together. It's not that I know everything about it at all. But it's this doing, this creating, this research that is an active creative process where the research, the creation, and even the pedagogy are always in this moving relation together.
Anyone who would like to respond to that?
Still, if you don't mind, can I go?
Of course.
I loved reading your work, and I love when you kind of describing the feelings and the movements and what's happening. But I'm still trying to, I mean, so there's the art practice, and there's the doing, and then there's the making. But the research is not happening. I mean, it's happening simultaneously, but it's not. You've still got to somehow record it and think about it and work with it in some way. So I get that they're entangled, but they're not indistinct processes. Or are they?
Hilary, before,
Yeah.
would you mind just saying a sentence or two about, just introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Hilary Jank. I'm in Johannesburg. I'm working on a book on a child becoming literate, which includes a whole lot of the child's writing, artwork, scribbles, scribbles that tell stories that I know are stories, not just scribbles. And so there's a difference between sort of making together with the child and then kind of thinking about what happened and recording it in some way. Yeah. And you're not recording it while you're making it, while you're doing it. So there's a separation of the processes, which isn't to say that the writing of it or the making a movie or whatever you're going to do with what happens isn't entangled with it, but they're not happening at the same time.
Well, let me give you a bit of a sense of how I work. When I'm with children, I walk into the studio and the walls are full of ideas. There are drawings and there's still drawings there, and children, drew them when they were 4 and now they're 18 years old. Some drawings are still there. So you walk into this room that holds a history, that you come in and it speaks. It's got life all around it. And as I'm engaging with children, I work closely with, in smaller groups with the studio. It may be groups, up to 8 children, but usually 4, 5, 6 children and 1 educator. I'm never working just by myself with children. There's always this movement of ideas. I photograph, that's my way. I can't listen as well without my camera. It is a way of attending, of listening, of always searching for, not just taking photos of what's going on, but really trying to look at things that are puzzling, the intersections. I video as well, so that there's aspects that are videoed, especially when there's lots of movement or conversations happening. That matters a great deal. Johanna and I, the teacher I'm currently working with, are writing notations. Children take notes also, and I can't always read them, but they take notes. There's a few children who are particularly beautiful at taking notes of what's going on, sit with a clipboard and they're writing their notes, drawing little notes. Then we have notational documentation that's always going up on the wall, that are little bits of conversation, little insights, drawings from children. So all these notations are there. So in a sense, yes, research is happening all the time. There's always this documenting, recording, but never in the full story, never, in little bits and pieces. And so it's this way then of moving with those, beginning to create with it. Then I might, when I'm finished in the studio in that morning, I'll go and edit videos, and that process of editing and pulling bits out again is trying to figure out what are the salient moments, what are the provoking moments, where are the mysteries here, where are the intangible elusives here. Beginning to create short segments of video, going through the photos, writing up a little bit more notations. But it's this, I see research as a very creative process, like an artistic practice of bringing these bits and pieces together. And over time, it's never, you know, have one experience with the children and then know what that is and writing about it and conceptualizing and interpreting and doing that, you know, the reflective work. It's always gathering these bits and pieces and over time beginning to put things together in such a way that it doesn't necessarily explain what's happened. It isn't always this retrospective. It is putting it together in such a way that it is leading us somewhere, that it is telling us where to go. It is telling us, you know, opening up sometimes multiple pathways that you've got to make a choice on which to pursue at that particular moment. But again, it is like knitting these strands. And how I knit is I rarely start with a pattern unless there's something deliberate I want to make. But, you know, I start knitting and then I undo and then I knit and undo. And eventually it takes a form. And so that to me is almost like how I research, is the bringing things together, putting it together. Sometimes you have to undo and get these loose strands that still hold the memory of things. I like that you're knitting, Karen.
And I was just thinking, and this is also like not actually starting from anything in particular.
Exactly. And then you might drop stitches that you might have to go back and fix, or else you leave as a hole and you stitch around it and emphasize the hole in the opening. But again, it is seeing research not as this, again, not the qualitative, have an experience, then go back and make sense, but always seeing research as this forward moving creative act of, and I really like how David Roussel writes about creating a map you could walk into. This idea that research is this way of forming something that I could step into, that we could move into, rather than research as the explanatory process of what has happened. I have no idea, Hilary, if I've actually answered your question, but it is this way of thinking about research as the doing, the making, the creating as we go, and something is being formed as we go. And quite honestly, nothing is ever in its finished form. It is always left in a way that it could be continued on, that I could take, you know, what we did last year, bring it together with something we did 10 years ago, and what we're engaging currently, and begin to knit those strands together again.
Would you like to respond to that, Hill?
No, I think that's very helpful, actually. Thank you.
You know what really strikes me about it? I'm just in this situation where I was in a classroom for over 6 weeks, and I'm actually still have to do the pedagogical documentation. But some of, you know, what we started to notice at some point is how the rug worked right at the beginning, and how, yeah, that doesn't make sense at all when I say this like now, but how the material started to work when during the first session, it was a philosophy for children session, and I slid on the floor, and it was on a rug, and it was really high piled rug. And then how the children almost, it gave permission for them to do certain things as we went along with the materials that we brought in. Anyway, it is, but you know, I have been struggling with beginning, you know, how to begin to make some of these connections. I mean, I've made loads of connections, but for writing, and your point about it's not about explaining, because I think that's so often that my first impulse is to say, oh, I need to explain, you know, how the materials worked throughout, right? Rather than, no, I love what you're saying, is the opening up of multiple pathways, of making connections, which it's not about, Barad would say, it's not something that's in the past that you go back to, but it is, as what George, before we actually started this meeting, about returning. So returning to the event, and, you know, like as if it's a compost heap, and we go and, and of course that's a
Mhm.
metaphor that Barat and I think also Haraway uses, where you just go through it as like a little worm and digest it and spit it out and poo it out and do something with. And that's really exciting. That's really, really helpful. I don't know whether that resonates with anybody else in the room, with your research. Please feel free to, yeah. Is this research? Is this pedagogy? Or shouldn't we even separate between the two?
And can the strands be unwoven? I don't know that, for me, I don't know that they can be. I can see there's distinct characteristics to each, but can they be untangled and looked at, as if they're just, I use the image with students a lot, is it's not a jigsaw puzzle of just putting these pieces together, and that it's much more of this interweaving where you can't pull them apart after a while.
Yeah.
But in any creative work, if research is a creative work, any creative work, the hardest part is starting. How do you start? How do you begin? Charlotte, you have a question?
It's born out of a frustration when you're doing research attached to a institution, because what you just described was absolutely incredible, and I would love to be able to be in an environment like that. And here comes the horrible but. I think I can relate to Hilary a little bit in that when I've taken a post-qual study to my ethics board,
Mm-hmm.
and they ask me to put boundaries around things for what I can and cannot use and how I can and cannot engage, that sometimes causes a disruption, because I would argue everything is entangled. And like you described in that studio, everything is entangled. But as you were talking about it, I was thinking, so do you have ethics for the children that enter? Do you have permission for their artistic work to still be on the wall? And these are all the questions that I've faced within the institution. So I'm wondering around that. I'm not sure it's a formulated question, because I think I absolutely agree with you on your research approaches. I would just love to know how you navigate that within higher education. And I know I'm coming from a UK context, so perhaps that's a cultural misunderstanding.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, because again, yes, it's how do you take something through ethics board and get ethics approval for this? And that's probably where I begin, because the ethics board does separate pedagogy and research. And that's probably where I do have to make a distinction. But then I take a bit of time saying this is describing the pedagogical work, how that works, the ideas of pedagogical documentation of children as co-constructors, co-creators, and giving a sense of the context, and then saying and then you have to use the ethics board language. It becomes an ethnographic study. I don't necessarily say it's artography, but it is the interweaving of the arts, the research, and the pedagogy that creates it. But then it's, being very clear, I'm working with what has been generated in a pedagogical context and going to be creating. And then I also ask, sometimes it's a retrospective ask of families to say, can I use what has been gathered for pedagogical purposes, for research, to publish in these places, to use it in this way? And then, of course, it's the consents, consent for children's words, for their images, for their drawings, for for use of their name, all of that still. But it is a difficult, it's not an easy process with, I mean, I'm fortunate in a small teaching focused university with a fairly new ethics board, that I was on the ethics board for, 4 years, to actually begin to say this is the pedagogical context that we work in, to become, so that the ethics board becomes familiar with this way of working in early childhood. And what does it mean to think about pedagogical documentation? It's not just going in, looking, and taking away. It is this, how do you create a way of putting it forward that this pedagogical work is always this co-constructed, co-composed work. Children are partners. We're side by side with children, not researching on children.
Yeah. Does that help, Charlotte? And also, would you mind where you work? And
Sorry,
a short introduction. Would you mind, Charlotte? Which university?
I work at Nottingham Trent University, but I'm a student at the University of Northampton, so I'm in two different spaces, and that's really helpful. And it's I think it's Katie Strom, but I'm not 100%, who talks about the sort of temporary barriers or boundaries we have to put on something. And I liked what you said there, Sylvia, about the ethics where you have to use their language.
Yeah.
But it's nice to think of it in terms of you being part of a university that's quite receptive to being educated around how that research is taking place. And that's something that I'm just a little bit jealous of more than anything. I would just like that too. But yeah, really useful. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Also very good, very strategic, you know, to be on the board for 4 years yourself, so that you really get the. But I think, I mean, it's my experience is that it is how you argue your case, right? And that you just show ethical awareness. But I'm just thinking, unless there is anyone who would like to continue this conversation, we can always come back to it. But the second question.
Sorry, Karen, can I just
Yeah.
say something in response to what Sylvia said before?
Yeah.
So I'd kind of sort of seen this kind of work as a way of trying to recapture or describe like what happens. But what you just said that I thought was very nice was about, first of all, it's what happens in and across time. You know, time is not linear, and so the different bits and pieces come together. And I really liked the way you described the research as itself a making that creates pathways. So it's like, you know, all the stuff sitting there, the pictures of what one would normally call data, but it's actually it speaks in relation to all sorts of other things and what you're trying to do, including theories and people that you've been reading. And I like the idea of it as a remaking, if you like, or another form of making, of the making.
Yes,
I found that very helpful.
A researching.
Exactly, that is very important. The recomposing, the researching, the remaking, and that the remaking involves the undoing, the taking apart, the opening, and putting it back to, you know, putting it together maybe in different ways. But it's also, and I guess this is also how it might connect to the next question, but it is also this way of walking into a space where the space speaks to me. That all these ideas, little bits of things are around me. And so again, it's always in this space where all these little notations, the images, these things are talking to me, and then in that beginning to create. It's not just the gathering of the observations, which so often can be the way of pedagogical documentation, of having an experience, going and documenting it, and then revisiting as if now you've got to relook at it, instead of how is it becoming this process of constantly creating as you go?
Anna has raised her hand.
Yes, thank you. And I was really late. Someone put a notification on Facebook, so I saw the topic is so interesting, but because of the time difference, I'm in New York, so I wasn't sure when it was starting. So sorry, it's not like I wanted to be rude and come very late. No, it just happened this way. But the topic is very interesting. I just want to very briefly say, because I was late, so I am only reacting to the discussion now here. And by the way, I am from the City University of New York, so Graduate Center, City University of New York, as it says in my email here. So anyway, so I was reacting to the point that it's not about explaining, yes, and I totally agree. This resonates with me very, very strongly. So it's not about explaining. I would add to this, it's also not about discovering or searching, because researching, now someone emphasized searching, but searching is again about something that is out there. So it's separate from me. So I'll just find out, I will explain, I will search, I will discover. And the other option, I really think, which is very important and good, which the previous person just spoke to, and I don't see the name, but just someone who spoke, Hillary, right? I guess, but emphasizing, or was it emphasizing the making? Well, exactly. So instead of finding out, discovering, explaining, all of it out there, how about this being creating, which means, of course, making, remaking, unmaking, undoing, and doing, but really something that would not juxtapose me and what I do in my research and us and what we do in our research, because this searching, discovering, explaining really presupposes something that is separate from me. So I just walk around, I look around, and I search for things. But no, as soon as we're there, we're part of the story. So then it's just what is going on in terms of our making and self-making, by the way. So it's if it's a discovery, it's probably a self-discovery and self-creation, any research, well, any activity, I would say. But that's just very close to the notion, which Barat uses, by the way, but very briefly, and I've written more in detail about that, but about ethics and onto-epistemology being together. So Barat uses ethic, onto-epistemology as one word, and I think it can mean really a lot if we take ethical and epistemology together and place ourselves also for scrutiny, put ourselves up in terms of autoethnography and self-disclosure. And so that's what we're discussing in my class right now. So, but sorry if it's not totally in line with what was discussed, but I'm taking notes of your names and I'm going to look up your work. So this is exciting. So I'm glad to be here because yes, there are resonances. I can see definitely resonances.
Yeah, thank you. And I think one of the, I mean, I agree with you with the ethical onto epistemology, and but it is, can you say that to an ethics committee? So
Right,
it is, what how can you,
Okay.
what do you say to whom and how? Yeah.
Can I react very quickly?
Yeah, of
The
course.
ethics committee, we tend to make too much of them. Their only concern is whether we hurt or harm our in our research, our participants. I prefer to, of course, to say participants. Okay, so if you make the case, no one is gonna suffer. I'm not gonna hurt or harm anyone. That's the only care they have, and that's their institutional obligation. They are not charged with, and let's not assume they're charged with judging what we do, whether it's sound, whether it's valid, whether it's theoretically, ontologically, epistemologically, and so on. We just assume they don't have any authority to interfere with any logic of research other than the harmful effects. That's their mandate. That's the RB process. They're only charged with that. And you need to hold your ground. We hold our ground at CUNY, definitely. We're a very, radical university. I don't know if you know, but yeah. So our students, by the way, resist IRB and really push back and talk back and definitely hold them in their place. Please don't make too much of them. They're not a committee to judge the merits of your work on any grounds other than the potential to hurt or put someone at risk. So that's the mandate. You can look it up. It's described like that.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and welcome, Teresa. And actually, as we are now moving to the next question, it's a perfect one for you, Teresa, as well. Is how do you know as a teacher at atelierista what to go for and take further? And you already said earlier on about the arts, our languages, right? And so to what extent, what I have always found so inspirational, actually, I do I say, provoke as well, but inspirational, is how, in the project Azione, in projecting it forward, how the switching of the language is one where you would say, oh, this is the right moment to say, oh, let's draw this or this concept. Or when you were saying, that when the children come in, I said, how do I draw a crowd? Or, or do you do that with clay, or do you do that with, and so maybe you can say a little bit more about, what is the hunch? What is it that sticks? I am not going to say the glow. I'm not going to use that one. But whether we call it teaching or research, maybe you can say a little bit more about, you've got such an experience. Did you say 18 years of 18 years of doing this work? Maybe you can say a little bit more about that.
I mean, I love the question, how do you know? And my straight, simple answer is I don't know. And you also have to be completely prepared all the time to take a pathway that's not going anywhere, that, it's trying things out. And I love it when children, I propose something and children say to me, no, Sylvia, you're wrong. That's not how it is. Like that in whatever way. Or you ask a question and children say absolutely nothing. Then you need those, like in any creative work, it is not about, and I guess to me the question is never what is next, ever. It's not I've done this, now what do I do? It is more about what am I giving form to here? What could I give propositional shape to? What would happen if I bring this together with this? What happens if I begin to tie things together? What happens if we go in this direction? And again, this always are these beautiful questions that pedagogista Cristina Delgado has provoked with, is like the what if and the perhaps. It's not ever knowing, and that's what I enjoy so much about the work. It always puts me in question of, and as soon as you try to go down the conventional pathways, I remember, early on trying to do what they were doing in some Reggio centers, is having children draw their ideas and then create it. And there was one little boy who would just constantly say to me, Sylvia, I never know what I'm going to draw until I start. And so it's taking these, it's like getting a sense over time of what are children's ways? How do I work with their ways? What are the ways of drawing? And the ways of drawing to me are never just, here's the paper, now how am I going to start with a mark? It's like drawing this giraffe. We had these massive paper mache giraffes and zebra and a taxidermy bear, which is a whole other story, how we got that brought into the room to actually, and then wasn't so much about just addressing the question directly. It's watching these ways of children, of the ways that now the measuring tape has to come out. You've got to measure the giraffe, and and it turns out they're not measuring for height, they're measuring for weight. All these numbers, and the numbers don't stay still as you're counting. And so, there's constant movement, but the ways of drawing are not always drawing. It's in the movements, it's in the wandering, it's the gathering of ideas, it's paying attention to what are the lures and the fascinations, not the interests of children, because that can often be so surface. And children are interested in a million things, but what are the lures? What are the fascinations? So it's getting a sense of the tone, the movement, all these things that are tangling together, the problems, the difficulties, that the dissonances, and then beginning to work with those and putting things together. It's rarely saying, here, children are interested in measurement, now let's do measurement. It's, what do we bring it together with? What other problems do we bring it together with? Problems are incredibly generative. And it could be a small problem. How do I draw the profile of a giraffe? Which actually isn't small, that's a big problem. But or it could be all kinds of things. How do I draw mystery? What are these mystery lines doing? What does this, what does this word, these languages do in the room? I'm much more interested in, I guess, what things do, what they bring, what they set in motion, and what happens when I bring things together, rather than what is this, what does this mean, so not the objective factual, but the possibility of where could this lead us? What would happen if I brought these things together? And lots of times you could be, trying to put things together that don't want to go together, or you put them together and then you just have to leave them on the shelf for a while, metaphorically, and come back to it later. But it is this way of creating a path as you walk it, rather than knowing exactly where you're going. But at the same time, always, again, Christina's voice in my head, always having a sense, projecting towards something. But that towards is never a small little thing. It is never something, a question that can be answered. It's questions that can't be answered. What is mystery? How does mystery live? What are the textures, the senses of mystery, which is what we're in right now, what we've been following for about a year, is also choosing things to follow that are elusive, but you're still walking towards something.
Sure.
That's my process.
I think Hillary would like to follow up on that.
I was in the group that generated that question, and it was, I'll tell you what we were trying to get you to talk about. I mean, I think your answer is wonderful, but maybe the specific one will just help you understand what we were getting at. Where you describe moving with the material and moving with the children, and then sort of changing the configuration to see if kids will follow, to push the movement into a kind of different place. And we were wondering, we thought, that's part of the attunement, and it's part of where you're talking about attunement. And we were wondering kind of like how you experience it. Not as a thought, but because there isn't really, I don't know if you're really thinking, or you're just going with the flow, and the idea comes to you. We were trying to get a sense of how you arrived at a movement that might change what happens. If it's like a thought process, or just a sort of an intuitive, embodied way of feeling with the children that pushes things. You're trying to get a sense of what actually happens in your body as you're moving, and then changing the shape of the movement.
Yeah, and ultimately I never work alone. And it's never me. I mean, I work with an amazing group of educators, and currently working with Johanna, who is this most beautiful improvisational educator who very intuitively brings things together. It's like a child was drawing a picture of a unicorn, trying to draw a unicorn, and draw a unicorn, and the unicorn had two legs. And as she's sitting in the room, and the person in the kitchen is roasting potatoes, and she says, I hate, she talks about how she hates the smell, how she hates roasted potatoes. She can't stand it. She draws little roasted potatoes and crosses them out on her drawing. And then what Hannah does is look at the drawing of the unicorn with two legs and says, well, how would this unicorn run away from those potatoes with only two legs? So it's bringing things together that you've got a problem with the drawing. The unicorn only has 2 legs, and how do you draw the 4 legs, which is a whole other representational problem with children, and then give it a reason to run away, give it a reason to actually think about those 2 legs. And so it's those, but to me, it's in the small moments. It's never in the huge, now what do I do? Even though, but I'm always working with another educator. We're constantly bouncing ideas off. So, you know, sometimes, you know, there's ideas proposed, I might propose, she might propose, and, you know, I might say, or she might say, you know, no, not that yet. And so it's always in relation. If I had to do this totally by myself, I'm not sure what I could do. So it's the children, it's the materials, it's me, it's the ideas, it's Johanna, it's these other educators in the room, always in, and it's this constant place of invention. But again, that is that question of how does it happen? I think I could probably show rather than tell. You know, and that's what I try to do through my writing, is show these nuances, but it doesn't actually tell you what I'm thinking at that moment, because it's not always a conscious thought. It's a move. It's a, you know, what about this? What if we bring this drawing here? It's always a what if and a perhaps, which lots of times could go nowhere. And again, children do tell me, Sylvia, that's wrong. It's which I really welcome, because you need someone to tell you, no, not that way. So I don't know if I could really answer that question. I could show it, maybe. I could write about it and narrate things in a particular way that gives a sense of the life that's happening, but actually to explain this is how. And I guess that's the challenge, but then I'm in it as an artist. As a creator. I am not in it as just a researcher trying to figure something out. I'm in it as a creator.
Yeah, and it's speaking to you.
Yeah, yeah. And then it's composing spaces too that speak to me, that put me in a bit of dissonance, that I don't know when I walk into a space that I've created. You know, maybe it's you know, we have the large adult studio space, and I begin to create and compose a space. It's never composing it to give a sense of what children are going to do. That's never what I do. It's putting things into play that help me stand in the middle of something that I don't totally know what's happening, so that I have to create in that.
Sure. That's beautiful. And it's nice. Thank you, Hill, for just giving the specific context for that, which I think was with the choreography article by the looks of it. So the third question, and then, you know, you have been talking about that in lots of different ways as well. Can you say more about your data analysis and how to attune to data, and which theorists you find inspiring and why?
Yeah, and so again, the question to me, and this is what my colleague Kathleen Cummin raised, you know, a while ago, is what counts as data? To me is the big question. That the data to me is not an observational data. This happened and I'm describing it, even though I do some of that. It is all the bits and pieces of things, and then to me, analysis. And so when I read this question, I actually went to the etymological dictionary and looked at analysis, because how do you keep an idea alive? Often that's where I go back to. And from the etymological dictionary and the parts that I've pulled out of it, analysis is not to explain or inform, it's to loosen, unfasten, cut apart, open up, which I really like that idea of how, you know, what is being loosened, what is being opened up here, what can I unfasten, not just put together in a cohesive way. And certainly that's part of it. But I also think about, and this is back to artography, the idea of rendering. What is being rendered to me is like a drawing. A drawing is rendered mark on mark on mark on mark, and slowly an image begins to take shape. to me, that is the analysis process. Again, I guess all these questions in my mind are very entangled. It's like, again, the analysis is the meaningfulness, you know, the life. How do I enliven the life of this show, the life of it? Not necessarily explain the meaning or explain, you know, an interpretive perspective on it. It's this, and I'm wandering a bit, but all these strands do tie up together. I like how Erin Manning writes about artfulness as art as the way, and these ways of collecting the data, collecting these bits and pieces and beginning to knit them together, create something with them so that it gives shape to things in a particular way. To me, that is the analysis process of creating something from these bits and pieces, not explaining them, because I don't know that I could ever explain what goes on. Often, you know, if I have visitors in the studio, I think, what on earth are they going to see? They're going to think nothing's going on here because it's a slow, long process of working the ideas, stitching things together, bringing things together, and again, giving shape to something in it. And I think, to me, that is what I do with the data, the bits and pieces, the drawings, the conversations, the video, the photos, the reflective comments. Johanna's, you know, our conversations together, conversations with other educators, you know, all these processes are ways of trying to put things together in such a way that it gives form to something, but it's still only ever provisional form. It is never a set thing that I can put aside and say, now I've done that. Everything is always, I would say, in the making, and it pauses periodically because here's the shape right now.
Just a very quick, but I think Finn is already gone. She says, I'm afraid that I can't stay for the whole conversation. Oops, now it's going. But I want to thank you for all this opportunity to listen to such an exciting conversation, which stretches my ideas of research with more than human. Many thanks to the organizer, and especially the wonderful work of Sylvia, but she's already gone. And Annika says data is something given etymologically, which is contra to the ethos of making a / creating. And yeah, and I think there are quite a lot of post-qual writers, you know, just really work with data or write about data differently. And the whole thing about creation instead of discovery, or there are quite a few comments about that too. And just a quick one in between, because I'm getting more and more intrigued and puzzled about the children. They are at university. You're at university, right? And the children come in. So I'm just trying to picture that and imagine in the place where I work now at the University of Oulu, which is, you know, the children come in and they go to the crash, to the, you know, where it's not a place for children in the sense of teaching. But you were saying that it's not a teaching lab as such. So, I mean, for some of us here in the room, they're working with students that come to the university, and you know, the way I've worked or tried to work in a similar kind of way was with students who are becoming teachers, as a way they can be inspired to work in a similar way with the children, right? So maybe you can say a little bit more about that, because are you only doing it with children and then people are observing you, or also are you working in this way with adults?
Yeah, I actually don't work really any differently with children as I do with adults. It looks, you know, it looks different. The context, the situation.
Hang on a minute, Sylvia. I think someone has got their I don't know who
I'm
it
just
is.
quickly muting everyone. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think that's better.
Yes, thank you.
To me, in a classroom with adults, it looks different, but it still is that creative process. I always try to do something I've never done before. It may not be, you know, bold and big, but it's to always always putting myself in a bit of question so that we could create something together, begin to work ideas together. And always, you know, and as much as possible, always connecting with the Children's Center, with the children, with the educators there, intersecting, so that there's a sense of this is how we, you know, this is a way of working with children. It's a way of thinking with each other. It's a way of being in the world where ideas become things you work with. You don't just know and then regurgitate. It's like, what does it mean to work an idea? To work, you know, what does it mean to not just read about and think about, you know, new materialism or feminist materialisms, but then what does it mean when we're in a space and we're with children and we're drawing to actually work those ideas and think through them. But I don't, you know, and again, we have the Children's Center right next. There's a laneway that separates us from the early childhood department space and the Children's Center. So we're, you know, we've expanded through the university, you know, in recent years, but that was always this very close relation. You look out the window from the adult classroom or it's turned into an adult studio now, and you see the Children's Center right there. And the children's studio space is in the early childhood department building. It isn't in, there was never space for it in the Children's Center. And so there's a lot of movement, physical movement between, and, you know, you could see each other. And so it's not so far as an adult student conceptually to be thinking about children. And then I have other courses where I bring students, the whole class, into the Children's Center, and we create events for the children to document and to think it through. But it's also acknowledging the Children's Center as its own pedagogical space with its own life. It is a reflection of the department. It actually has its own life. And when you come into the center, you come into something that has its own life, its own way of being, its own pedagogical commitments. You come into something. It's not just, you know, here are the children and now we're just watching them and taking away. It's how do you enter a space that is living already, has its own commitments, its own life, and what does that do to you then when you come in?
Wow.
But that was something that was, again, I'm benefiting from decisions that were made years ago before I got to Capilano University to actually rethink this relation between the early childhood department, the university, and the Children's Center. And even the name change, you know, it used to be a child care center. Now it's a children's center. That was an important switch, that it was that children have a play, and we're still working that through in terms of, you know, what place, what role, what life can the Children's Center have on campus where there are children here as part of the community instead of they're just children, you know. We did a project years ago where adults would, you know, students are always coming into the Children's Center, working with children, taking things away. And so we turned the gaze around in the studio where children were studying students, drawing students, thinking about who is this student? How do we know if this is a student? And apparently students always have backpacks and they have coffee. And that's how you know that they're a student and not just anybody else. But again, turning the gaze around. So it's children studying students, not just students studying children.
Any other comments or questions? Angela's is called Children's Campus. And
sorry, I joined in late, so I just got
yeah.
in here. I love that idea that the children are studying the students.
Yeah.
That's
And you were
Yeah,
welcome.
I also
Teresa?
I also came late, but I did read with a group. We read the movement, the choreography paper, which was fantastic. And I think what was so lovely about it was, and maybe this has got to do with what you were saying about analysis, like the writing was also sort of like a choreography. I don't know if that makes sense, but there was so much movement in the writing, and that whole thing about how do you write and not make something sound like it's finished, closed, or so intended from the beginning, and and I think that's you've really got that feeling in the writing that you're following the bodies in the fabric and following what's happening, and so it was very enjoyable.
But
Teresa?
that's not an easy thing. Like, to me, that's something that over the years trying to get of how do I not just explain, how do I not just tell, but how do I and I can only, and I write best when I'm in the midst of things, not just separate from it. And so it's how do you write in a way that catches that sense of movement so that as I write, I feel it, not just talk about it.
Sure. Teresa, would you mind introducing yourself very briefly?
Okay, hi. I'm based in Cape Town. I was at Wits University for quite a while, working in the foundation education foundation phase, and working in arts education and then early years. And I did some research with a group of 5-year-olds in a preschool for over a couple of years. So that kind of I don't know, that magical encounter of like when every day is the beginning of the world kind of experience was something very, very special to me, having been somebody working more in high school. It was as I worked my way down to younger and younger people. I think I really value that, and that's and I So thank you. I've read and really enjoyed your work over the years. So now I'm at the Center for Creative Education in Cape Town, working with teacher education.
Thanks, Teresa. Whoa, gosh, I can never really quite get how fast time goes, when it goes like this. It's just wonderful. We've got 5 more minutes or so left. Anybody?
Hillary's hands up.
Yeah, go on. Hill. But you're muted though. I think everyone was muted at some point because there was so much noise.
So, Sylvia, for me, it was like you were trying to capture the affects. That's what it felt like. It felt like I was getting some of the affect.
Oh, good. I'm glad that then I guess writing does do something if you could feel the sense. But again, back to what Teresa, you said something about it. I mean, I'm so privileged to work with young children, like where you're in the middle of all this vibrant figuring out of life. It doesn't matter, ability, disability, language, anything. It is this, you're in the middle of this vibrant time in children's lives. And outside, at least here, outside of formal schooling. So there is incredible freedom. We don't always take it in early childhood, but there's incredible freedom to invent with children. And I've worked in teacher education and before, and this is particularly vibrant because it's children and young children, and the ideas and the ways that ideas are so mobile and fluid, and they're always in movement. It's like I think it's Lisa Law Olson who writes about all these things thrown up in the air. and I begin to catch and put, and you don't just throw it up and let them drop. It's like you catch a couple things and pull them together, and what happens if? And again, that's always, I think, with children, what is most interesting is not the answer. It's not where you get to, it's the figuring out. And so for me, that's where I stay in the figuring out and never getting quite to, now this is the final, what I've done, what it means.
Anna?
Yes, I'm happy to say what you just said. It also goes for science. Science in general is about questions, not answers. Is about always making the next step. So it's just fascinating to think that what we are talking about, what you are talking about, is very much applicable really to a very wide spectrum of things such as science, research in general, physics. That's what good scientists write about. It's not what the textbooks in science say, because they just give formulas, and it's very sad actually. But science is about questions, not answers. It's about puzzling. It's about provocation. It's about invitation. Provocation is a very good word. And not to take too much time, I just want to say I mentioned one work, not for self-promotion, but just to say in the chat. I just put there the work to draw your attention to people in Australia. Just, I don't know if people here, anyone is from Australia, but this is a very strong group. They are working with very young children, and there are more people there. If you're interested, I'd be happy to give more. But it's just nice to be connected broadly. I see your group. It's very fascinating. I'm glad I stumbled and stopped by very briefly. But there are people all over the world. It's so exciting. Now in Australia, the very strong, wonderful group. Their work is direct. It just came out, a book that you can just open it on, actually on the internet. It's available directly. Auntie Salomon, very young, working with very young children. And then the group of Marilyn Fleer also. So just to say, it's so I'm not promoting myself. I'm just saying they do use my work, but that's not the point. They are really very strong, exciting people doing exciting work there. Thank you all again, not to take too much time.
Thank you. Now, I mean, I think that leads nicely into maybe George saying a little bit about there's some reading groups for people if they want to follow up on it, but also to say a little bit about what's going to be happening next month. And before we thank Sylvia, and Sylvia, we also wanted to just kind of warm down just after we finished, because otherwise it's like, oh, suddenly you're gone, and that would be a real shame. But yeah, George, would you like to say a little bit about what's happening next? And I'm going to, I don't know how to turn your hand. Anna, if you can put your hand down. I don't know how that works, but anyway, it doesn't matter really.
Right.
Okay.
Firstly,
I
thank you
did.
so
I
much.
just did.
Oh, thank you.
This has been such a generative and interesting conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. I have put my email address in the chat because there are quite a few new faces, and if anyone would like to join our reading group, you can just pop me an email. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. So the next thing that we are doing past, so this was September, and in October, we will be looking at a book that actually in our series we'll be looking at 3 chapters of a book by Josie Quinn called Invisible Education: Post-Human Explorations of Everyday Learning. So we'll do the same thing that we did this month, where for 3 weeks we'll read in the reading group different chapters, and then we'll have a discussion with Josie Quinn in the 4th week. So that will be on the 28th of October. So it'd be great if people who are interested would like to join. And then we will announce what will come after that. It's still a little bit up in the air, but for now we have October. Yeah, it's all emerging.
We'll do it.
As
We'll
we
do
go.
it.
Yeah, it's happening. But yeah, so we're excited for October. And as I say, if anyone would like to join the reading group, you can just send me an email.
Yeah. In November we're going to do entries from the glossary, but yeah,
yes,
we need to still organize some of that. But Just want to thank you, Sylvia. I mean, I've just got
Thank you so much.
so many new ideas, but also just come at a really good time. I always think, you know, the universe somehow. So one of the things you can do, I don't know whether people know that, but this is a YouTube clip, that also you can get the text then, right? So because I would love to just read this as we have been reading your articles, because it's just fabulous the way you talk about your work, and it has definitely affected me how you talk about it, and inspired me and provoked me to do my data analysis differently the coming 2 months, which is something that I'm about to start. So yeah, it was and I know, you know, it is a special beginning of the new academic year and how busy people are. I just so appreciate you taking time for this. And yeah, so thank you on behalf of everybody. I don't know whether other people would like to say a quick thank you. And maybe they can use some emoticons to do so, or maybe say it, or knit it.
Meta, thank you. Well, it's been lovely being here. It's been a pleasure. Great questions. I've loved the questions. I like questions that you can't ever really fully answer. You know, you walk around them. But thank
Yeah.
you for this invitation. This has been wonderful.
Okay, so
Thank you,
look at that, all these hearts. Thank you, Teresa. So okay, we say goodbye.